Welcome to this Tax Justice Network podcast looking at some of the findings of the 2020 Financial Secrecy Index and its relevance for North America. I'm Naomi Fowler from the Tax Justice Network's monthly podcast, the Taxcast, and I'm speaking to the Tax Justice Network's Andres Knobel and John Christensen. The United States has long been a big offender in the Financial Secrecy Index rankings. A few years ago, a study revealed that the United States is the easiest place in the world for a criminal or a terrorist to open an anonymous shell company to launder their money with impunity. The United States has increased its score. How come?
The US has increased its secrecy score mainly because New Hampshire now offers private foundations without proper transparency disclosure. Private foundations are a type of legal vehicle very similar to trusts that can be used for wealth concentration, tax planning, and to hide the beneficial owners of assets. The US also offers trusts which do not require proper registration. Now, with New Hampshire's new law offering private foundations, the US has a new type of secretive legal vehicle that can create financial secrecy risks all over the world.
So, they've done this, they've increased their secrecy score. Why isn't the United States number one on the Financial Secrecy Index this time?
The main reason why the US has remained in second place and not took the top place has to do more with the Cayman Islands. The US actually keeps being a major financial center, actually the biggest exporter of financial services to non-residents, and its secrecy score, basically the legal framework that analyzes the transparency legal framework of the US, actually got worse. However, Cayman Islands' secrecy score also got worse, but Cayman Islands also increased by a lot its global scale weight, meaning the value of the exports of financial services to non-residents, most likely because of the presence of the hedge fund industry.
So we've got really what has long been a pariah state. We were kind of expecting that it might make it to number one this year, had it not been for Cayman with its massive increase in market share, perhaps it would have done. But even though it's still at number two, like last time, it has still increased its supply, the size of the market of financial secrecy, by 15%. And its secrecy score has risen as well.
Yeah, and I think some people might be surprised by that. But you talk to any experts on offshore finance and they'll all agree that states like Delaware, Nevada, Wyoming and South Dakota belong right there at the very top of the rogues gallery. And I think it's fair to use the term pariah state. What elevates the United States to second worst on the Financial Secrecy Index is the huge market share that they have in offshore financial services. It's over 20%, going on 22% of the global market for offshore financial services. This is largely due, of course, to the dollar's role as the global reserve currency, which has served the US really well because so many rich owners of wealth across the world want to hold dollars, particularly at times of global uncertainty. And especially since the 2008 financial crash, the banking crash, then led to quite a number of economic crashes across the world, crises, and there's been a lot of wealth flowing into the dollar. Now, marry that huge market share with the secrecy of all the offshore shell companies and the offshore trusts. South Dakota, for example, is doing a roaring trade with offshore trusts, and the US really is the giant at the table. Now, what makes the US a pariah state, in my opinion, is its steadfast refusal to join in with multilateral initiatives like the Common Reporting Standard. Now, Washington might argue that it has its own information exchange process, so-called FATCA, but that standard is largely non-reciprocal, which means that while foreign banks are obliged to tell US authorities about American citizens with offshore accounts, US banks are not obliged to tell the authorities of other countries about citizens from those countries with offshore accounts with the US banks. And as far as I'm concerned, this boils just down to pure naked abuse of political power. And just bear in mind that FATCA is not a Trump measure. It comes from the Obama administration. So, we can't pin this one on Donald Trump.
Right, and a common reporting standard is the mechanism by which automatic information exchange happens between countries in theory, and most major economies around the world signed up to it ages ago.
Yes, and we've seen quite a lot of progress in the direction of other countries around the world signing up to it. And gradually it's establishing itself not just as a global norm, but a global multilateral norm, with more and more countries engaging in it and sharing information with other countries. So this is, one of the big success stories, and it's reflected in the way that the general trend of the index showing a global improvement, because this really has been a game changer.
Right. Andres, Canada's performance is really disappointing. I mean, it has supposedly a kind of liberal government, yet its secrecy score is now worse than Luxembourg.
Canada's secrecy score is very disappointing, especially when we think about beneficial ownership transparency. While most countries are starting to implement beneficial ownership registration laws, especially in Europe, but also in Latin America, in Southeast Asia, and some countries in Africa, Canada is still lagging behind. In Canada, there is no even complete legal ownership registration, let alone beneficial ownership one for companies. So Canada should do a lot more to improve its beneficial ownership transparency for all types of legal vehicles, including companies, partnerships, and trusts.
What should the United States do now?
The most urgent thing for the US to do now in terms of transparency is to join the OECD's Common Reporting Standard for automatic exchange of information, or otherwise make sure that all the FATCA-related agreements to exchange information automatically are fully reciprocal, in the sense that the US starts sharing information with every other country as much as it receives it. Importantly, the US should start sending information to other countries about the beneficial owners of the bank accounts held in US financial institutions. Secondly, the US should urgently start implementing a beneficial ownership registration law for companies, for partnerships, for trusts, and especially for private foundations, now that New Hampshire also offers private foundations. While most countries in the EU, but also in Latin America, Southeast Asia, and Africa, are starting to implement beneficial ownership registration laws and even disclosing this information in public online registries, the US still doesn't have any of these. Lastly, the US should make sure that country-by-country reports become publicly available for all types of multinationals covered.
Thanks for listening. You can read more on the methodology and results, along with plenty of other data, on www.financialsecrecyindex.com.